We start in the year 1707, which is a massive moment because this is when England and Scotland finally joined together to create what we call Great Britain. The very first person to sit on this brand new unified throne was Queen Anne. Anne actually became queen a few years earlier in 1702, but she made history with the Big Union. Now, Anne's life was incredibly sad. She was pregnant 17 times, but tragically, none of her children survived to grow up. Because she had no surviving heirs, her death in 1714 brought the Hanoverian dynasty to the British throne. The British politicians were terrified of a Catholic taking over the country, so they looked at the family tree and went all the way to Germany to find a Protestant relative. This brings us to King George I, who took the throne in 1714. George was literally a middle-aged German guy who didn't even speak English when he arrived in London. You can imagine how awkward that was. Because he couldn't understand what his ministers were saying, he didn't even bother turning up to government meetings. Instead, he let a politician named Robert Walpole run everything, which accidentally created the role of the very first British Prime Minister. George was never popular in Britain. He preferred staying at home in Germany, and when he died in 1727, the British people were not exactly crying. His son, King George II, took over in 1727, and he was just as German as his dad. The two absolutely hated each other, which became a bit of a family tradition for the Georges. George II loved the army, and is famous for being the very last British monarch to actually lead troops into battle. Under his rule, the British Empire started expanding massively around the world, beating the French in several major wars. He died quite suddenly in 1760, bizarrely, while sitting on the toilet, leaving the empire to his young grandson. And that grandson was King George III, who started his massive 60-year reign in 1760. Unlike his dad and granddad, George III was born in England, spoke English perfectly, and actually cared about the country. But he is famous for two massive things. First, he was the king who lost America. He taxed the American colonies, they got furious, threw tea into the harbor, and won their independence after a brutal war. Second, later in life, George suffered from a severe mental illness, which made him act so strangely that people called him Mad King George. By 1811, he was completely unable to rule, so his son had to step in as a royal babysitter, officially taking full power as King George IV in 1820. If his dad was the serious, hard-working king, George IV was the ultimate party animal. He loved expensive clothes, massive palaces, and heavy drinking, which made him wildly unpopular because he spent the taxpayers' money like water. He was so incredibly out of shape from his wild lifestyle that the public and the newspapers made fun of him constantly. When he died in 1830, Britain breathed a massive sigh of relief. He had no surviving children, so the crown went to his younger brother, King William IV, in 1830. William was already 64 years old when he became king, and because he had spent his youth serving in the Royal Navy, everyone called him the Sailor King. He was much more down-to-earth than his party boy brother. He would literally walk around London on his own, chatting with ordinary citizens like a normal person. His short reign was all about changing old laws, including banning slavery across the British Empire. He died in 1837, passing the throne to his tiny 18-year-old niece, who would completely change the world. That 18-year-old niece was Queen Victoria, who took the throne in 1837, and she ended up ruling for a massive 63 years. When she started, Britain was changing fast, but under her rule, it exploded into a global superpower. This was the Victorian era, the age of steam trains, massive factories, and an empire so big that people said the sun never set on it. Victoria married a German prince named Albert, and they were deeply in love. But when Albert died suddenly, Victoria was so heartbroken that she wore black for the rest of her life and barely showed her face in public for years. By the time she died in 1901, the world was a completely different place. Her son, King Edward VII, took over in 1901. He had waited nearly 60 years to become king, and he wanted to make up for lost time. Edward was a total contrast to his serious mother. He loved fancy parties, fast cars, horse racing, and good food. Even though he only ruled for 9 years, he was incredibly popular because he brought a sense of fun and modern style back to the royal family, helping to steady the monarchy as the world moved into the 20th century. When he died in 1910, his son became King George V. George was a serious, quiet man who loved collecting stamps, but his reign was hit by absolute chaos. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Because the British royal tree was packed with German relatives, people started getting suspicious of them. To prove his loyalty to Britain, George did something radical. He completely changed the family's royal name from its German roots to the very British name of Windsor, which they still use today. He was also the first king to speak directly to the public on the radio at Christmas, making the royals feel closer to ordinary people than ever before. George died in 1936, and his eldest son became King Edward VIII. But Edward caused the biggest royal scandal of the century. He fell in love with an American woman named Wallis Simpson, who had already been married and divorced twice. Back then, the government and the church completely refused to let the king marry a divorced woman. Edward was told he had to choose between love and the throne. Shockingly, he chose love. After less than a year as king, and before he was even officially crowned, he gave up the throne and left the country, leaving Britain in utter shock. This meant his younger brother had to step up, becoming King George VI in late 1936. George never expected to be king, and he absolutely hated the spotlight, mostly because he suffered from a terrible stutter that made public speaking a nightmare. But when the Second World War broke out in 1939, he became an absolute hero. Even when bombs were dropping on London, he refused to leave the city, staying to suffer alongside ordinary citizens. This bravery made him incredibly loved, but the stress of the war ruined his health, and he died quite young in 1952. His 25-year-old daughter then stepped up to become Queen Elizabeth II. She ended up making history by ruling for an incredible 70 years, making her the longest reigning British monarch ever. Elizabeth became a permanent symbol of stability as the world went through massive shifts, from the invention of the internet to the fading of the old British Empire into a peaceful club of nations. She was the queen that almost everyone alive today grew up with. When she passed away in 2022, her son finally took the throne as King Charles III. Charles had spent his entire adult life preparing for the job. Long before it was trendy, he was famously passionate about protecting the environment, fighting climate change, and supporting young people. Today, he faces the massive challenge of keeping an ancient tradition relevant in a modern, fast-moving world, bringing our long line of British monarchs right up to the present day.